In the summer of 1933, a man named R.W. Wall walked onto a quiet stretch of farmland in eastern Oklahoma to sign a piece of paper that would change the fate of an ancient civilization. He was acting as the local contact for a group of 6 men who called themselves the Pocola Mining Company, and the paper he signed was a 2-year lease, granting them the right to dig into a grass-covered mound rising from the floodplain of the Arkansas River. Nobody watching that afternoon thought they were witnessing anything unusual. A lease was signed, some money changed hands, men picked up their shovels. 2 years later, almost to the day that lease expired, something happened to Wall that even those closest to him struggled to explain. He died, according to several historical accounts, under circumstances described only as mysterious. By then, the men he represented had already tunneled more than 40 feet into the heart of what would become known as Craig Mound. They had broken through into a sealed chamber untouched for roughly 600 years. What they found inside would be compared, within months, to the tomb of an Egyptian pharaoh. What they destroyed in the process would be called one of the greatest archaeological disasters in North American history. This is that story. What was actually inside that mound before 6 men with shovels and dynamite got to it? Why did the man who signed the original lease die the moment the digging stopped? Was it coincidence, or does history sometimes keep a stranger kind of ledger? And what does it mean that the people whose ancestors built this place are still trying, nearly a century later, to understand what was taken from them? For decades, the low, grass-covered rises scattered across the floodplain near the town of Spiro, Oklahoma, drew little attention. Farmers plowed around them, cattle grazed across their slopes. To most who passed by, they looked like nothing more than natural swells in the land, the kind of feature the Arkansas River leaves behind after centuries of flooding and retreat. Some of the mounds were barely noticeable, low humps rising only a few feet above the surrounding fields. One, however, stood apart. Locals simply called it the Big Mound, or later Craig Mound, and even without any formal study, its size suggested it was not the product of ordinary erosion. In 1914, a professor from the University of Oklahoma named Joseph Thoburn looked closer. He photographed the mounds and conducted limited testing at one of them, a buried house mound he catalogued as Ward Mound 1. What he suspected, based on the shape and the scale of the earthworks, was that this was not a random geological feature at all. It was the remnant of a planned settlement, deliberately built, and almost certainly far older than anyone in the area assumed. His photographs from that year remain some of the earliest visual documentation of the site, taken nearly 2 decades before anyone understood the scale of what lay beneath the surface. Thoburn wanted to continue his investigation. The landowners, descendants of Choctaw and Chickasaw freedmen who farmed the property, refused to allow further digging. For nearly 2 decades, the largest of the mounds sat undisturbed, its interior a complete unknown even to the archaeologist who first identified it as significant. Whatever lay inside remained sealed, protected less by law than by the simple reluctance of the people who owned the land to see it disturbed. What Thoburn had glimpsed, without fully realizing it, was only a fraction of a much larger site. The complex eventually mapped by later archaeologists included roughly a dozen distinct mounds spread across an 80-acre floodplain, arranged around what had once been a central plaza. Some of the smaller mounds covered house foundations. Others appeared to be platforms, raised earthen bases that likely once supported temples or the residences of community leaders. At its peak, researchers now believe the surrounding settlement may have supported as many as 10,000 people, a population scale that would have made it one of the larger population centers in North America at the time, centuries before European contact. Then came the Great Depression. By 1933, the economic desperation gripping rural Oklahoma had reached the farmland surrounding the mounds. A group of local men, later described in newspaper accounts simply as treasure hunters, approached the property owners with an offer. If the family would grant a 2-year lease, the men would dig into Craig Mound, the largest earthwork on the property, and split whatever they found. Some accounts describe rumors that had circulated for years of Spanish gold supposedly buried in the region centuries earlier, carried by explorers who never made it back to the coast. Whatever the men believed they were searching for, gold or otherwise, the property owners agreed. Wall signed the lease that summer for a modest sum, and the digging began almost immediately. At first, progress was slow and unremarkable. Using little more than picks and shovels, the men who called themselves the Pocola Mining Company dug through layers of ordinary soil, finding scattered pottery fragments and the occasional human bone. Curiosity seekers stopped by the site, offering a nickel or a dime for anything that caught their eye. Nobody involved treated the work as archaeology. It was, in their own words, no different from prospecting for ore. Then, roughly 30 feet into the mound, the shovels struck something unexpected. Fragments of conch shell began appearing, engraved with intricate designs unlike anything the diggers had seen before. Faces, symbols, patterns that seemed to follow a deliberate artistic language, unfamiliar even to men who had spent their lives in that part of Oklahoma. The men kept digging, no longer certain what they were looking for, only that it was worth more than anything they had found so far. What followed, over the course of nearly 2 years, became one of the most significant and simultaneously most destructive archaeological events in American history. Tunneling deeper into Craig Mound, the Pocola diggers broke into a sealed inner chamber that had remained untouched since it was closed, by some estimates roughly 600 years earlier. Inside, they found an almost unimaginable concentration of ceremonial wealth. Copper ornaments hammered into elaborate shapes, engraved shell gorgets depicting figures in ceremonial dress, elaborate textiles woven from feathers and fur, some of the finest examples of prehistoric weaving ever recovered anywhere on the continent, ceremonial maces carved with careful precision, effigy pipes shaped like animals and human figures, pearl beads by the thousands, strung and unstrung, scattered among burial after burial, layered one atop another, each accompanied by objects clearly meant to signify status, ritual authority, or spiritual protection. The scale of what emerged from that single chamber startled even seasoned collectors. Some pieces were unlike anything previously recovered from any site east of the Rocky Mountains, showing artistic and technical sophistication that few had expected from a prehistoric culture in this region. Many of the engraved shells carried imagery later associated with what researchers call the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, a shared symbolic language of dancing figures, weeping eyes, and winged serpents that appeared, in varying forms, across Mississippian sites throughout the American South and Midwest. Seeing that same visual vocabulary concentrated so densely in one Oklahoma burial chamber suggested to later researchers that Spiro had functioned as a major crossroads for ideas as well as goods, a place where distant communities exchanged not only copper and shell, but belief. Textiles preserved for 6 centuries, protected only by the sealed, oxygen-poor conditions of the chamber, began disintegrating the moment they were exposed to open air. Witnesses later described a child playing with a feathered cape pulled from the mound, watching it crumble to fragments within minutes, an object that had survived 600 years destroyed in an afternoon by simple exposure to sunlight and wind. None of this was documented with anything resembling scientific method. No stratigraphic records were kept, no systematic mapping was done. The diggers simply removed what they wanted, discarded what they didn't, and began selling artifacts from the trunks of their cars along nearby roads, and later through advertisements in relic collecting magazines that reached buyers across the country. Word of the discovery spread quickly, reaching newspapers across the region. In 1935, the Kansas City Star published a feature describing the site as the King Tut of the Arkansas Valley, comparing the scale and craftsmanship of the recovered artifacts to the famous Egyptian tomb discovered barely a decade earlier. The comparison, sensational as it sounds, was not entirely unwarranted. Archaeologists who later studied photographs and surviving artifacts described the Spiro assemblage as among the richest ceremonial deposits ever recovered in North America, comparable in artistic complexity, if not in gold, to anything found in Egypt. By the time that article appeared, however, the site had already suffered catastrophic damage. Forrest E. Clements, an anthropologist at the University of Oklahoma, had been trying for over a year to intervene. He identified previously unknown Mississippian-style artifacts appearing on the collector's market and traced them back to the site near Spiro. He attempted to negotiate directly with the Pocola diggers, offering to buy out their remaining lease so that proper excavation could begin. They refused. According to multiple historical accounts, when the lease finally approached its end in 1935, the diggers set off dynamite inside the tunnel in what many researchers believe was a final effort to extract whatever remained before their legal access ended. The explosion collapsed sections of the chamber and destroyed artifacts that had survived, undisturbed, for 6 centuries in a matter of seconds. Clements' efforts did not stop there. Alarmed by what had happened, he helped push through Oklahoma's first antiquities law later that same year, requiring all future excavations at the site to be licensed through the University of Oklahoma. It was one of the earliest legal protections of its kind in the country, passed specifically in response to what had occurred at Craig Mound. Beginning the following year and continuing until 1941, a large-scale scientific excavation, this time properly documented and funded in part through Depression-era public works programs, attempted to recover whatever understanding could still be salvaged from what remained. By then, historians estimate that more than 1/3 of Craig Mound had already been destroyed. Thousands of artifacts had been dispersed to private collectors and institutions across the world, from museums throughout the United States to collections in France, Germany, and beyond. Much of the site's context, the precise arrangement of burials, the sequencing of construction across centuries, the relationships between the individuals interred there, was gone permanently, lost the moment each object left the ground without record of where or how it had been found. To understand what was actually lost at Craig Mound, it helps to understand what the site once was to the people who built it. Archaeologists now identify Spiro as a major ceremonial and political center of the Caddoan Mississippian culture, occupied and expanded between roughly the 9th and 15th centuries. At its height, the site served as a hub within a vast trade network that reportedly extended across much of what is now the central and southeastern United States, connecting communities from the Rocky Mountains to the Gulf Coast. The people who built it were the direct ancestors of today's Caddo Nation, along with related Caddoan-speaking communities including the Wichita and the Pawnee. According to Caddo tradition passed down across generations independent of any archaeological record, the world itself was shaped through a cosmology tied closely to the sun, the moon, and the movement of the stars. That cosmology was not simply belief, it was structure. It shaped where buildings were placed, when ceremonies were held, and how communities organized their calendar around the rhythm of the seasons. Archaeological surveys of the Spiro site appear to support this connection in ways that go beyond coincidence. Researchers have identified solar alignments built into the layout of the ceremonial plaza, suggesting the site's builders tracked the sun's position with careful, sustained attention across generations. Twice each year, at the summer and winter solstices, oral tradition and archaeological evidence together suggest that thousands of people gathered at Spiro for multiple days of ceremony, some involving purification rites, ritual fasting, and the drinking of a ceremonial tea made from yup and holly, believed to cleanse both body and spirit before sacred rites could begin. Within Caddo tradition, the individuals interred with the greatest ceremonial wealth, the same burials the Pocola diggers tore through in 1933, are remembered not simply as wealthy elites but as spiritual intermediaries. Some accounts describe them as priest rulers, figures who bridged the world of the living and the world of the dead, responsible for maintaining the cosmic order the entire community depended upon for its survival and its continuity. The elaborate regalia buried alongside them, the maces, the engraved shell depicting figures in ceremonial dress, are interpreted by researchers as symbols of this dual authority, part political, part sacred, worn by individuals who were expected to carry that responsibility even into death. Caddo tradition holds these ancestors and the ground in which they rest in continued reverence today. Tribal representatives have spoken of Spiro not as a historical curiosity, but as a living connection, a place where their ancestors remain and where the disruption of 1933 is remembered as more than a loss of artifacts. It is remembered as a disruption of an order that was never meant to be broken, one that connected the living community to the cosmic and ancestral forces that shaped their world. Whether that disruption carries any consequence beyond the historical and cultural is not something this documentary can answer. What can be said is that the timing surrounding Wall's death remains, in every historical account that mentions it, described only as mysterious, with no further explanation offered by the record. Historians who study the Pocola dig do not draw a direct connection between his death and the site itself. They simply note that it happened at precisely the moment the digging came to an end, and that the record has never explained why. Was that timing simply an unfortunate coincidence, the kind history is full of? Or does it deserve more attention than it has received? And if the people who built this ceremonial center understood the world as governed by cosmic order, sun, moon, and the careful rhythm of the seasons, what does it mean that the moment their resting place was violated coincided so precisely with an unexplained death among those responsible? More than 90 years have passed since the Pocola Mining Company first broke ground on Craig Mound. In that time, archaeologists have worked to reconstruct what they can from photographs, salvage fragments, and the careful excavation that followed between 1936 and 1941. The mound visitors see today at Spiro Mounds Archaeological Center is, in large part, a reconstruction rebuilt using historical photographs to approximate what stood there before it was torn apart by 2 years of unregulated digging. What cannot be reconstructed is everything the tunnel destroyed before any scientist arrived, the exact placement of each burial, the full sequence of construction across 6 centuries of continuous use, the complete meaning behind objects that were sold for a handful of coins before their significance was ever understood by anyone involved. Some of what was lost will never be recovered, no matter how many decades of research follow, no matter how many scattered artifacts are eventually traced back to their original context. And yet, something has survived, something the diggers never managed to take. The Caddo nation and related Caddoan communities continue to hold Spiro as ancestral ground, continue to teach the cosmology that shaped it, and continue to advocate for the respectful treatment of what remains. Their connection to the site was never dependent on the artifacts that were scattered across the world. It was, and remains, a connection built on memory, on tradition passed from one generation to the next, largely independent of what any excavation could confirm or deny. Perhaps that is the deeper lesson embedded in the Spiro story. Archaeology can measure a mound, catalogue its contents, and estimate the labor required to build it across generations. It can even, in this case, uncover unsettling coincidences that resist easy explanation, timing that lines up in ways no historian has fully accounted for. But it cannot fully account for what a place meant to the people who built it, prayed within it, and were laid to rest inside it, generation after generation, for 600 years. That understanding survives elsewhere, carried forward through tradition rather than artifact, remembered rather than recovered from the ground. History is often imagined as something settled, written down, and closed, a sequence of facts that can be fully catalogued once the digging is done. Spiro suggests otherwise. It remains an unfinished account, part archaeological record, part cultural memory, part historical mystery that still resists tidy explanation nearly a century later, standing today as both a monument to what was built and a warning about what can be lost. Every few years, researchers studying museum collections identify another fragment, another engraved shell, another string of beads that can be traced back to that one chamber inside Craig Mound. Piece by piece, an object here, a photograph there, a small part of what was scattered in 1933 and 1934 continues, slowly, to be reassembled, even if only on paper. Whether the full picture can ever be restored, or whether some of what was lost that summer is simply gone for good, remains a question none of these later discoveries have fully answered. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy documentaries that explore forgotten history through archaeology, historical records, and indigenous tradition, consider subscribing for more investigations like this one. And before you go, I would like to hear your thoughts. Do you think the timing of Wall's death was simply an unfortunate coincidence, or does history sometimes leave behind questions we are not meant to fully answer? Let me know what you think in the comments, and I will see you in the next documentary.